Hello and welcome to another video. Today's video is going to be something different. Since the release of Dark Souls Remastered for PS4 and Xbox One, I've wanted to do something special for this game. This is one of my favorite games of the last 10 years, and a remastered version, this is the best way to play this game now. And I've been kind of toying with the idea of how to present a video about this. I don't want to specifically do just a straight review because I'm reviewing a game that came out 7 years ago. It's just a remastered version. Other than updated textures and graphics and resolution, there's not really much else that has changed about Dark Souls in this remaster. So it doesn't really warrant, I can't sit here and tell you, hey, the game is this much better or this much worse. It's the same game, it just runs better. And so rather than do a typical review for Dark Souls, I'm presenting almost a retrospective on Dark Souls for me personally, my experiences with the game, kind of reminiscing of what it was like back in October of 2011 when the game originally released, and everybody kind of scratched their heads and wondered what this was, because before Dark Souls there was only Demon Souls for the PS3, and while I had played a little bit of that game before Dark Souls came out, it didn't really scratch the itch I was looking for at the time until I played Dark Souls for the Xbox 360. And I will have to state here, this is going to be one of the more ambitious videos I've ever done for the channel. It's going to be different, there's going to be a lot more narration, and I hope you guys enjoy this. I've had a lot of fun filming and recording this video specifically, and I wanted to do kind of a love letter to the original Dark Souls because I love that game that much. So anyways, guys, without further ado here is my Dark Souls retrospective / review of the remaster.
Ah yes, Dark Souls. The name alone sounds incredibly daunting, and if you're like me, it's been a huge staple of your gaming life for nearly the past decade. And if you're new here to the channel and you've never heard of Dark Souls, at this point you probably are living under a rock, maybe you're wondering just what all the fuss is about. Well, today's episode is a very special one of sorts, as I'm going to partially review the Dark Souls Remastered that was just released this past May, as well as have a bit of a retrospective with this very special title. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. I'm a gamer that grew up on Metroidvania-type experiences. I think throughout my life at this point I've probably played through Symphony of the Night at least 20 times. It took me until Dark Souls 3 to realize that this franchise is probably the 3D Castlevania version we've always wanted and never gotten. Sorry, Lords of Shadow, I still love you. In the fall of 2011, there were quite a few big titles that I was waiting for to be released. In fact, if memory serves me correctly, Dark Souls was released around the same exact day as the original Rage, a game that I was a bit more excited about at the time. And while Rage really didn't pan out for me, what did pan out for me was Dark Souls. Now, my history with Dark Souls is quite an interesting tale in its own right. You see, Dark Souls is a different kind of game. It's special. It's unique. It's very much a one-of-a-kind experience, and while many others have tried to emulate, copy, or change up the Souls formula over the past decade, the original still stands the test of time with me. Now, on a side note here, yes, I am fully aware that Dark Souls is the spiritual successor to Demon Souls, which many count as the first true game in the series. My experience with Demon Souls is much less. I played through about half of that game before putting it down for something else at the time of its release. If per se there was ever to be a remaster of that game, I would very much want to play through that game in its entirety. Well, now we have that out of the way. Good. After briefly playing Demon Souls, I didn't really know what to expect with Dark Souls. The biggest reason I was excited about the release of Dark Souls was that I was getting a Souls game on the platform of my choice at that time, the Xbox 360. Dark Souls is a game I dived into with little to no fanfare. I didn't know what to expect, other than the combat and the mechanics would be very similar to its Souls counterpart. You see, as many of you may have heard, Dark Souls is a game that is very much a deliberate challenge. Dark Souls doesn't care about you. It doesn't care about the fact that you may be carrying enough souls, which is the currency to level up your character 3 times after you've defeated a boss. You might turn a corner, get demolished by an enemy that you can normally take to thanks to low health, and lose everything that you have. You will die. You will die again. You will die again, and again, and again. It's a punishing and brutally difficult experience for a first-timer. Back in 2011, not knowing anything about this series was my first true dive into From Software's world that they had created. But it's the experience around the game, outside of the game, that is something that I wasn't expecting. I would run into conversations at work, at school, online while playing a game with a friend, and so on, about this game. Strategies would be exchanged between people on how to defeat a boss, how to find a rare weapon or ring, or perhaps a secret illusionary door. Honestly, I don't think a game since Dark Souls has gotten a community together in a way that this series has. And well, yes, we've had 3 of these games now, 5 if you're counting Bloodborne and Demon Souls. Nothing for me will ever top the experience that I had with the original Dark Souls. Hell, people were drawing grid maps for the first time in ages for something that wasn't D&D. The concepts in Dark Souls are basic once you understand them. You are a hallowed survivor. You can collect humanity, put yourself in human form, and you collect the souls of the enemies you defeat to level up your character. Putting yourself in human form has its advantages and its many disadvantages, and perhaps brings up one of the game's biggest strengths. While you are in human form, you have the ability to summon up 2 different people from a different game. This does require an internet connection, but the reward for bringing in another player to help you with a demanding boss or a particularly challenging area can be extremely rewarding. This isn't your typical cooperative experience either. You don't wear a mic and talk to your co-op partner when summoned, as they will only stick around the certain area you are in until you defeat that area's boss, and they are automatically ejected from the game. Co-op brings a fun dynamic to this game, and at the time was a revolutionary idea. It may seem like a small thing today, but in 2011, this was a huge deal. However, human form does have a major setback. While yes, the game does offer help in the way of co-op, it can also be the downfall, as human form also allows for enemy spirits to invade your game as well and challenge you to a duel. Enemy invasions are also human control players, and this presents the game's player versus player element. And while even if you die, you can still go back and reclaim the souls you've lost, it can be particularly challenging if you are invaded in an area that is close to a boss, killed, and then have to attempt to backtrack all the way there, hoping not to be killed in the process. See, when you die in Dark Souls, you leave behind a bloodstain. In your game, this bloodstain will allow you to pick up the souls that you've lost. They'll remain there until you die again, so if you don't reclaim them and die again before you reclaim them, they are then gone forever. If connected online, you can also see the bloodstains of other recently deceased players that will allow you to tell if something may be lurking behind a corner. Dark Souls is also a game that tells you nothing. It harkens back to the days of the Nintendo Entertainment System, with The Legend of Zelda not explaining that you have to do X and Y to get to Z. You either have to have a strategy guide or figure it out yourself. However, during the first month of this game's release, it was an actual crapshoot of people figuring out how to do certain things in the game. Now, if you've been with me on this channel since the beginning, you know that I'm a huge fan of horror games and horror games in general. Dark Souls, unintentionally, can be known as one of the downright scariest games that I've ever played. It could be from the tension of not knowing what's going to be around the next corner, or to some of the just overall weirdness and oddity of the game itself. Take for example some areas when you defeat an enemy. Just the damn noise is really, truly terrifying. Just take a listen here. So at this point you might be asking yourself, how do you save this game? Well, that is truly one of the trickiest parts of this franchise. You see, every so often there are bonfires you can rest at. Resting at a bonfire will respawn about 90% of the enemies back into the game. Some enemies are excluded, including bosses, but most respawn back into the world. Use bonfires wisely, as they are also a place you need to use to offer humanity to become human, to level up your character, attune magic spells, and refill your Estus flask, which is your main source of healing in the game. In later sequels, bonfires also provide your use of fast travel in the game. However, in the original Dark Souls, this option isn't presented until 2/3 through the main story, and even after you do this, you can only fast travel to certain key bonfires throughout the game. So now, let me talk a little bit about specifically the remaster. As you've seen, all of the footage in this video is of the actual remaster. It should be to no one's surprise that Dark Souls Remastered was one of my most anticipated games of 2018. Normally, I don't like to put a remaster on that list, but if there's one game that's much deserving of a remaster, it's the original Dark Souls. In 2018, before this remaster, there just really wasn't a good way to play this game. Sure, the incredibly broken PC port could be fixed by a little hacking and modding, but it wasn't an ideal way to play the game. Hell, even playing Dark Souls on backwards compatibility on Xbox One, you can still run into the sub 20 frames per second areas and the worst area of any Dark Souls game ever, the infamous Blighttown. Enter in the 2018 remaster, which fixes all of these issues by being locked at 60 frames per second. I specifically played the PS4 version of the remaster, which has all of the footage you are seeing here is from that version. I prefer the DualShock 4 controller now for Souls games, and the game runs at a steady 1080p 60 frames per second on a standard PlayStation 4 and 1800p 60 frames per second on a PS4 Pro. It's a gorgeous looking game still, but this version of the game also comes with a playable version of the game's worst area, Blighttown. Blighttown might be the single scariest place in this entire game. What makes Blighttown such a daunting place to go is that you can be poisoned at pretty much any time. You'll need to work your way down quite a few rickety ladders to get to the bottom of the area, which is filled with poisonous water. Don't worry, it's best to find a ring that will do a decent amount of nullifying most of the poison, but getting there was a challenge on the original version of this game thanks to its incredibly broken frame rate. It's already hard enough dodging poison darts and enemies and mosquitoes that are trying to kill you. Imagine doing that while enduring 10 frames per second. How about 8 frames per second? It was an utter disaster of an area. It was that bad. Blighttown was honestly the reason why I put this game down for almost a year, because it was simply unplayable. However, after coming back to the game a year later, with heavy persistence, I was able to overcome this area in the original game. However, even fixing the broken nature of this area, it's still an incredibly daunting and scary area of this game. This leads me to the final thing that I wish to talk about with Dark Souls, the bosses. Perhaps the shining beacon of any Souls game is the bosses that you will encounter throughout the experience. Some of the bosses can be incredibly daunting and frustrating, while others require just a keen strategy and patience. Each boss has a different pattern and can take a bit of time to master on your first run-through of the game. There's a real sense of elegance and passion that went into the boss design of the original Dark Souls. And while yes, I think there are some great, even fantastic bosses throughout all 3 entries in the main series, I feel no other Dark Souls has had any bosses that have ever topped the original game. So there you guys have it, Dark Souls. one of my favorite games of all time gets a remaster that is truly deserving of such an incredible experience. And while as a fan of these games, I can honestly recommend just about any of them. However, if you've never experienced a game in this franchise, then I can honestly say that you need to play this remaster, as it is the best jumping off point for this series. Just remember to be vigilant and persistent in your pursuit to the end. Make sure you pick the master key as your key item when you start the game, and honestly, I'd recommend playing as the Pyromancer as your starting character, although in the end, starting character doesn't really matter, as you can build your character out whichever way you prefer. Dark Souls is truly an incredible experience and one of my favorite games of all time. Anyways guys, I hope you enjoyed this video and this retrospective. Remember to like, share, and subscribe to the channel, and as always, until next time.
Thank you.